How do you beat the biggest government in history? The founders did it, but they knew there is no silver bullet. The path to liberty isn't flashy. It's slow, deliberate, relentless. And in 1767, the penman of the American Revolution discovered the key in ancient Rome. 4 Latin words, one strategy to topple an empire. This is the story of small things grow great by concord. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, August 1st, 2025. Let's get right to it. The year is 1767. Well, not for real, of course, but we're going back in time. The American colonies are on knife's edge. 2 years earlier, they had successfully nullified the hated Stamp Act. But even when the British repealed the act, they didn't actually retreat officially. They just changed tactics. They passed, on the same day they repealed the act, they passed another, the Declaratory Act, which claimed unlimited, centralized power over everything for all time. Parliament had the power, hath, and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America, subjects of the Crown of Great Britain, in all cases whatsoever, for everything. Forever. Now, while most people were actually just celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act due to the coordinated and very dedicated resistance that they put together in response to it, some people, like John Adams, for example, immediately grasped the ominous implications of the power claimed under the Declaratory Act, and he asked an essential question in his diary that would soon define the entire crisis. He said, "I am solicitous to know whether they will lay a tax in consequence of that resolution, or what kind of a law they will make. What are they going to use that for? They're claiming this power over us in all cases whatsoever in response to our resistance to the Stamp Act. How are they going to put this into practice?" Now, at first, it was just a threat on paper, and maybe some people let their guard down because of it. Even Benjamin Franklin, at first, he said, I think everyone's going to be cool with this. Everyone's going to be fine because we know that you have a similar act relating to the Irish. And we know you don't really use it, so we're not expecting it over here, so everything's going to be fine. But John Dickinson, who was known as the penman of the American Revolution later, he understood that that act was planting the seeds of something much, much bigger. He wrote, "This, however, was only planting a barren tree that cast a shade indeed over the colonies, but yielded no fruit." And it didn't take long for them to try to yield the fruit. And the answer to the question that John Adams posed arrived with the Townshend Acts of 1767. And into this chaos stepped John Dickinson, who wrote a series of essays in late 1767 and published them throughout the end of 67 and into 1768, called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. They became the most widely read documents on American liberty up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776. These were widely read, highly influential, a big part of the principles of the American Revolution. Now, he saw what most people missed, and he wrote, "No man who considers the conduct of the Parliament since the repeal of the Stamp Act and the disposition of many people at home can doubt that the chief object of attention there is, to use Mr. Greenville's expression, providing that the dependence and obedience of the colonies be asserted and maintained." So even though they felt strategically, the British did, they felt strategically it was in their best interest to get rid of the Stamp Act because they couldn't get it enforced because of all kinds of resistance, they weren't going to back down. They had a long game vision on this, and they wanted to put the colonies and the people of America, well, into a state of total dependence and, of course, total obedience. This is what empires have always done throughout history, and eventually they push it too far, and the hubris brings them down. For Dickinson, the great danger of the Townshend Acts was not the size of the new taxes being implemented. The duties were actually pretty small, and that, he warned, was the whole point. It was a trap designed to be overlooked. He wrote, "Some persons may think this act of no consequence because the duties are so small. A fatal error. That," he wrote, "is the very circumstance most alarming to me. For I am convinced that the authors of this law would never have obtained an act to raise so trifling a sum as it must do, had they not intended by it to establish a precedent for future use." He understood right off the bat that this was the British Parliament asserting their claim to power over the colonies and the people in all cases whatsoever, to create that scenario of total dependence and obedience. Get them to kind of go along with this little one, and it's like boiling a frog, right? You just get them a little more and more and more. We've seen this play out in modern times with the income tax, which was going to be just the tiny percentage on the richest of the rich, maybe even a temporary wartime measure. And now it gets worse and worse and worse. Anyways, Dickinson continued, "To console ourselves with the smallness of the duties is to walk deliberately into the snare that is set for us," praising the neatness of the workmanship. And his logic hit like a hammer. If Parliament had the right, the power to take even a penny from them without their consent, there would be no limit in the long run. And he said, in short, if they have a right to levy a tax of 1 penny upon us, they have a right to levy 1,000,000 upon us. For where does their right stop? At any given number of pence, shillings, or pounds? Well, of course not. Once you give them the right, or you allow them the right to do something that they don't have a right to do, maybe because it's easy to kind of just let go because it's not really affecting you all that much, you gotta know that sooner or later someone's going to build on that, expand that power more and more and more until they bleed you dry. He said to attempt to limit their right after granting it to exist at all is as contrary to reason as granting it to exist at all is contrary to justice. Now, the Townshend Acts were actually much more than just these small duties. There was also, for example, the New York Restraining Act, which suspended the Assembly of New York as a direct, intentional punishment for not fully complying with the Quartering Act a few years earlier. And Dickinson saw that for what it was. This was a targeted punishment, a first move in a game of divide and conquer. You attack one, and eventually they're going to attack another, and another, and another, and again, establish that power in all cases whatsoever. He said, but whoever seriously considers the matter must perceive that a dreadful stroke is aimed at the liberty of these colonies. I say of these colonies. He's making it clear, even though they were just going after New York, it's an attack on everyone. He said, for the cause of one is the cause of all. And he continued, if the Parliament may lawfully deprive New York of any of her rights, it may deprive any or all the other colonies of their rights. And nothing can possibly so much encourage such attempts as a mutual inattention to the interests of each other. So in other words, it may not be affecting you in South Carolina or in Georgia or Virginia or even here in Pennsylvania, but if they're going after New York and we turn a blind eye to it, we've established the precedent. We've voluntarily put chains around our unhappy country. That's what he said 2 years earlier in his very widely read and influential broadside, urging noncompliance with the Stamp Act as well. So the same approach, the same mentality. if you comply with it or you let it go, you've created a situation where they're going to expand on that power. Now, Dickinson was really kind of referencing a classic military strategy. He saw it being used against them politically, and he wrote, "To divide and thus to destroy is the first political maxim in attacking those who are powerful by their union." And that's when John Dickinson delivered the insight that would actually change everything. If the British were using small moves to establish big precedents over time, the colonists, well, they needed to do the same in the opposition to stop them. He signed off his first letter with a Latin phrase, 4 Latin words that would become the strategic foundation of the American Revolution: Concordia, res parve, crescunt. And Dickinson translated that to "small things grow great by concord." But he didn't invent that formula. He inherited it. He understood it from history. And to understand what he was channeling, we have to go back to where he learned it from. That's ancient Rome. And it's 41 BC. And the Roman historian Sallust was basically writing an autopsy on the Roman Republic, which was dying before his very eyes. I'm sure it didn't have too many years left as he wrote this. And it really started with the defeat of their great rival at Carthage. And he put it like this: and this is from a translation by J.C. Rolfe, "But when our country had grown great through toil and the practice of justice, when great kings had been vanquished in war, savage tribes and mighty peoples subdued by force of arms, when Carthage, the rival of Rome's sway, had perished root and branch, and all seas and lands were open, well, that's when they had no foreign enemy to fear. And so the potential dangers, instead of being external and from foreign forces, it turned inward. The very things that they fought for, peace, security, wealth, well, they became major problems." He said, "Then fortune began to grow cruel and to bring confusion into all our affairs. Those who had found it easy to bear hardship and dangers, anxiety and adversity, found leisure and wealth desirable under other circumstances, a burden and a curse. And 2 very specific diseases took hold, and they went rampant like a cancer. They became kind of the foundation of Rome's downfall." He said, "Hence, the lust for power first, and then for money, grew upon them. These were, I may say, the root of all evils. At first," he wrote, "these vices grew slowly. From time to time, they were punished. Finally, when the disease," I like how he calls it a disease, "the founding generation, the old revolutionaries often referred to usurpation of power, attacks on liberty as a deadly disease. In fact, John Adams once called it like a cancer. It grows faster and faster every hour." Anyways, back to Sallust. "At first, these vices grew slowly. From time to time, they were punished. Finally, when the disease had spread like a deadly plague, the state was changed, and a government second to none in equity and excellence became cruel and intolerable." For Sallust, this was no mere observation. It was evidence, the proof of a fundamental political law, a maxim with the certainty of a mathematical formula. And here we come to that great Latin phrase that Dickinson used at the end of his first letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. And there's actually 2 parts to it: Concordia, res parve, crescunt. Discordia maxime dilabuntur. And my Latin is absolute garbage, but I'm doing my best. Of course, Dickinson translated the first part as "small things grow great by concord." I've seen other translations. For example, the entire phrase shows both sides of it. For harmony makes small things great, while discord undermines the mightiest of empires. And so with that ancient warning echoing throughout history, we come back to the old revolutionaries who understood just what Sallust meant. The path to liberty, it was a long and difficult road. Samuel Adams really nailed it here, writing as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771. Instead of sitting down satisfied with the efforts we have already made, which is the wish of our enemies, the necessity of the times more than ever calls for our utmost circumspection, deliberation, fortitude, and perseverance. And I think probably no one articulated this strategy better than Thomas Jefferson in a letter to his great friend, I'm not your great friend, his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay. He said, "The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get." Eternally press forward. The ground of liberty is always in a struggle against power and government and empire. And Jefferson understood that, quote, "It takes time to persuade men to do even what is for their own good." As John Dickinson closed out the 12th and last of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, he didn't end with a legal argument or a deep historical lesson. Instead, he ended with a direct and personal challenge to his countrymen. "For my part," he wrote, "I am resolved to contend for the liberty delivered down to me by my ancestors. But whether I shall do it effectually or not depends on you, my countrymen." The path to liberty requires fortitude and perseverance and dedication to a real long-game strategy. That's why we adopted the phrase as our motto, Concordia res parve crescunt. Small things grow great by concord. You can actually see it, well, probably not on the screen here, but we have it printed on our membership cards, our official 10th Amendment Center membership cards, which we send out to all of our annual, 5-year, and lifetime members. And if you want to help us reach and teach more and more people about these essential principles from the founders, the old revolutionaries, and the great thinkers that they read and learned from, you can join us today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. We also have monthly options that start out as just as little as $2 a month. You don't get anything in the mail on that, but you can still help us get this work done. Now, while I'm here talking about these membership options, I do want to take a quick moment. I haven't done this in quite some time, and give a huge thank you to just a small handful of people that I picked out at random who have joined us as members recently. There's Naomi in Washington State. Thank you. Paul in Missouri, Barry in New Jersey, Emma in Texas, and Krista in Colorado. Thank you, all of you who have joined recently and who have been members for whether it's a month or 10 years. I can't say thank you enough for supporting the 10th Amendment Center. Of course, if you don't want to become a member but still want to help us out financially, you can absolutely do that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. We also accept gold backs, like real sound money if you want to mail it in, Satoshis, whatever works best for you works awesome for us. Thank you for any consideration you can give to giving some support to the TAC. There's also a number of free and easy peasy things that you can do to help spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the platforms you may watch or listen on. For example, watch time percentage on YouTube is a huge one. You watch a 10-minute video for 10 minutes, that's 100%. You watch it for 30 minutes, that's 300%, and way better. There's also reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platforms, hitting the like button, subscribe, get notifications, comments in the archives. Whatever you can do to interact with the various platforms really helps out a great deal. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this show. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next week here on the Path to Liberty.